Choose any woman, Elder Thorn commanded, his raspy voice echoing off the vaulted marble ceiling of the high hall. Any woman of noble blood, Cassian. The pact needs a Luna, and our fractured borders require a treaty. Pick one, and let us be done with this charade. Alpha King Cassian stared at the glittering, perfumed line of high-born daughters. He despised them all. He despised the council even more. Before Cassian could utter a word of refusal, a low, thunderous growl shattered the heavy silence. Ghost, his massive, battle-scarred warhound, a beast that tolerated absolutely no one but the king, broke rank. Ghost didn't approach the velvet-clad ladies. He stalked past them, nose to the cold floor, until he stopped in the shadows at the absolute edge of the hall. With a heavy huff, the terrifying canine dropped his massive head into the lap of a trembling servant girl clutching an empty silver tray. The grand hall of the Obsidian Keep was a masterpiece of intimidation. High, arched windows let in the pale moonlight, casting long, knife-like shadows across the polished black stone floor. Tonight, the air was suffocatingly thick. It smelled of expensive floral perfumes, nervous sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of political desperation. Cassian sat on the elevated throne, his posture deceptively relaxed. To the untrained eye, the Alpha King looked bored. His dark eyes lazily scanned the 20 young women presented before him. They were the daughters of the most powerful alphas in the territory. Draped in silks and rare jewels, their necks bared in a display of submission that turned Cassian's stomach. They were terrified of him, yet desperate for the crown. Beside Cassian sat Ghost. The warhound was an Irish wolfhound mix, standing nearly 3 feet at the shoulder, with a coat the color of storm clouds and a face marred by a jagged scar from the northern rebellions. Ghost was not a pet. He was a soldier. He hated crowds, hated sudden movements, and notoriously hated the cloying scent of the nobility. "We are waiting, my king," Elder Thorn pressed, stepping forward. The old wolf's eyes gleamed with thinly veiled ambition. "Lady Alara of the River Pack brings a dowry of 300 acres. Lady Vivian of the Summit Pack offers undisputed access to the iron mines. The choice is yours, but a choice must be made tonight." Cassian's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight, the leather of his armor creaking in the suffocating quiet of the room. He had spent the last 5 years bleeding in the mud to secure these borders, and now they wanted to cage him with a marriage certificate. In the far corner of the hall, half hidden behind a towering marble pillar, stood Luna. She wasn't supposed to be visible. Her job was to collect the discarded crystal champagne flutes from the perimeter tables and vanish back into the labyrinthine kitchens before anyone of consequence noticed her. She wore the drab, coarse wool uniform of the keep's domestic staff. Her dark hair was hastily pinned back, and a faint smudge of hearth ash stained her left cheekbone. Luna kept her eyes glued to the floor. She had learned long ago that invisibility was the only true armor for someone without rank, without family, and without power. But her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The sheer predatory energy radiating from the throne was making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, the rhythmic tapping of Cassian's fingers against the armrest stopped. A low rumble vibrated through the floorboards. Ghost stood up. The collective breath of the room vanished. Several of the noblewomen instinctively stepped back, their silk gowns rustling loudly in the dead silence. Ghost's amber eyes swept the room, entirely ignoring the line of potential queens. He lowered his massive head, his nostrils flaring as he caught a scent. Thump, thump, thump. The hound's heavy paws echoed as he descended the 3 marble steps of the dais. Cassian did not call him back. The king merely watched, his dark eyes narrowing with sudden, intense focus. Ghost bypassed Lady Alara, He didn't even glance at Lady Vivienne. He walked with the slow, deliberate gait of a predator tracking a wounded deer, moving straight toward the shadows at the edge of the room. Luna squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her spine so hard against the marble pillar she thought her bones might snap. Please, she prayed to whatever goddess was listening. Please just walk past. The heavy, warm breath of the beast washed over her knuckles. Luna froze. The empty silver tray in her hands rattled against her trembling thighs. She slowly opened her eyes and looked down. Ghost, the terrifying beast who had ripped the throats from enemy generals, was sitting squarely in front of her. He looked up at her with intelligent, amber eyes. Then, with a soft whine that echoed like a gunshot in the silent hall, the massive hound rested his heavy, scarred chin directly onto her rough, ash-stained hands. Someone in the center of the hall dropped a glass. It shattered, the sound ringing out like a death knell. Luna's breath hitched in her throat. She stared at the hound, then slowly, agonizingly, lifted her gaze past the beast, across the vast expanse of the black marble floor, straight to the throne. Alpha King Cassian was looking directly at her. And for the first time all evening, the king did not look bored. "Get that beast away from the servant!" Elder Thorne's voice cracked like a whip, shattering the fragile, suspended animation of the hall. His face had mottled into a furious, bruised plum color. "Guards, remove the hound and throw that girl in the dungeons for disrupting the ceremony." Two heavily armored guards at the perimeter stepped forward, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. "Take one more step." Cassian's voice rang out, quiet but carrying a lethal, vibrating undertone, "and you will leave this hall without your heads." The guards froze instantly, their eyes wide, boots glued to the floor. Cassian stood slowly. He was a towering figure, broad-shouldered and lean, moving with the fluid, coiled grace of a snake ready to strike. He didn't look at Thorne. He didn't look at the outraged, humiliated noblewomen. He only looked at the girl pinned against the pillar. Luna felt the blood drain from her face. She tried to pull her hands back, to drop the tray, to run. But Ghost whined sharply and pressed his heavy chin harder against her wrists, pinning her in place. The hound was deliberately keeping her there. "Cassian, this is a mockery," Thorne sputtered, stepping into the king's path as Cassian descended the dais. "The hound is confused. The girl reeks of the kitchens, of cooked meat. She is distracting him. You cannot possibly entertain this." "Ghost is never confused," Cassian interrupted softly, finally turning his dark, fathomless gaze onto the elder. "He tracked a rogue assassin through a blizzard for 3 days using only the scent of a dropped glove. He is not distracted by kitchen grease." Cassian stepped around the sputtering elder and began the long walk across the floor. The crowd parted for him as if repelled by a magnetic force. As the Alpha King drew closer, Luna's survival instinct screamed at her to drop to her knees and bare her neck. It was the law. It was instinct. Yet her knees remained locked. Her hands, still trapped beneath the hound's jaw, were trembling violently. But her chin remained level. She stared at the king's chest, unable to meet his eyes, focusing on the intricate silver embroidery on his dark leather tunic. Cassian stopped 2 feet away from her. Up close, the sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming. He smelled of pine, cold air, and something dangerously electric. He looked down at Ghost. The hound wagged his tail once, a slow, sweeping thump against the marble floor, and looked from the girl to the king. "He's never done that," Cassian murmured, his voice pitched so low only Luna could hear it. Luna swallowed hard, her throat sand dry. I don't have food on me, sire. I swear, I was only collecting glasses." Her voice was a raspy whisper, rusty from disuse. Cassian tilted his head, studying her face. He noted the coarse wool of her dress, the frayed edges of her collar, the ash on her cheek. But his gaze lingered on her eyes. They were a startling, clear gray, like the sky just before a heavy snowfall. And despite the terror vibrating through her small frame, she wasn't crying. She wasn't pleading. "What is your name?" Cassian asked. "Luna, my king," she breathed. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the immediate area. Luna, the title they were trying to force upon him, given as a name to the lowest servant in his keep. The irony tasted like ash. "Sire!" Elder Thorn had followed him, his voice shaking with indignant rage. "The council demands a choice. The packs are waiting for an alliance." Cassian didn't break eye contact with the servant girl. He saw the way her jaw tightened at Thorn's words. He saw the faint, barely visible white scar that peeked out from the collar of her coarse dress. There was a story there. Ghost smelled it, and Cassian suddenly wanted to know it. "The council told me to choose any woman," Cassian said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the dead silent hall. "Those were your exact words, Thorn." "Any woman," Thorn gasped. "You cannot be serious. She is a nameless rat. She has no bloodline, no dowry, no power." "She has my hound's approval," Cassian replied coldly, finally turning to face the elder. "Which is a damn sight more than any of you have." Cassian reached out. Luna flinched, bracing for a strike. Instead, his large, calloused hand wrapped gently but firmly around her wrist, lifting her hand away from the dog. Ghost immediately stood up and leaned his heavy side against her leg, a clear, physical barrier against anyone else. "The ceremony is over," Cassian declared to the stunned room. He looked down at the wide-eyed servant girl. "Come with me." They bypassed the kitchens entirely. Cassian led her through a set of heavy oak doors that Luna had spent her entire life scrubbing the hinges of, but had never once stepped through. They entered the royal wing. The stone floors here were covered in plush, crimson carpets that swallowed the sound of their footsteps. The air smelled of beeswax and expensive hearthwood. Luna's mind was entirely blank. The shock was so profound it had anesthetized her terror, leaving only a hollow, ringing sensation in her ears. Ghost walked closely at her side, his shoulder occasionally bumping her thigh, keeping her moving forward. Cassian didn't say a word until he pushed open a set of double doors leading into a massive, opulent bedchamber. He gestured for her to enter. Luna stepped inside, clutching her empty silver tray to her chest like a shield. The room was larger than the entire servants' quarters. A massive four-poster bed dominated the center, draped in dark furs and silk sheets. A fire crackled warmly in the hearth. Cassian stepped in behind her and closed the doors. The heavy click of the lock sounded like a prison door slamming shut. Luna instantly retreated, backing up until her shoulders hit the cold stone of the fireplace mantel. "Please," she whispered, the numbness finally breaking, allowing the panic to flood back in. I don't know what you want from me. I have nothing." Cassian walked to a heavy oak side table and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He offered one to her. She didn't move. He set the glass down on a nearby table. Taking a slow sip from his own, he watched her over the rim. "I don't want anything from you, Luna," he said, his voice shedding the commanding alpha resonance he used in the hall, dropping to a tired, grounded register. "You can put the tray down?" She didn't drop it. Her knuckles were white. "If you don't want anything, then why am I here? They will kill me. Elder Thorn will have me gutted the moment you leave the keep." "Elder Thorn cannot touch you in this wing," Cassian said, stepping closer to the fire. He looked exhausted. The lines around his eyes deepened in the firelight. "And you are here because if I had chosen one of those high-born daughters tonight, I would have handed half my army over to a rival pack. The council wants a puppet queen they can control to keep me on a leash." Luna stared at him, her chest heaving. "So you used me, to spite them." Cassian paused, lowering his glass. He seemed genuinely surprised by her bluntness. Servants didn't speak to the Alpha King with accusations. They spoke with apologies. "Yes," he admitted, entirely unashamed. "I did. But I also trust my hound." He looked down at Ghost, who had curled up on a massive fur rug near Luna's feet. Ghost doesn't just sniff out assassins. He senses intent. He senses survivors. He walked past 20 women drenched in expensive perfume to find a girl hiding in the ash. "Why?" Luna clamped her mouth shut. She looked away, staring into the flickering flames. "You're not trembling anymore," Cassian noted quietly. Luna stiffened. He was right. The violent shaking in her limbs had stopped. "You were terrified in the hall," Cassian continued, taking a slow step toward her. He moved carefully, reading her body language like a battlefield map. "But you weren't terrified of me. You didn't flinch when I approached. You flinched when Thorn yelled. You were terrified of being seen." Luna's grip on the tray tightened so hard her fingers ached. "I am a servant. Being seen means being punished. Don't lie to me," Cassian murmured. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He reached out and gently took the silver tray from her rigid fingers, setting it aside. "You have the posture of someone who has been beaten, but the eyes of someone who fought back. Where did you get the scar on your collarbone?" Luna slapped her hand over her throat, her eyes flashing with sudden, defensive fire. It was the first time she had looked directly into his eyes since they entered the room. "I fell," she lied smoothly. Cassian stared at her, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in a dark, humorless smile. It was a terrible lie, and they both knew it. "You're going to sleep here tonight," Cassian said, stepping back and breaking the intense proximity. "In the bed. I will take the couch in the study next door. Tomorrow, the council will demand an audience. They will try to tear you apart with words. They will try to prove you are unfit, weak, and unworthy of the title." He turned and walked toward the heavy adjoining doors of the study. He paused, his hand on the brass handle, and looked back at her over his shoulder. "Prove my hound right, Luna. Survive them." Luna did not sleep. She spent the entire night sitting rigidly in the center of the massive, silk-draped bed, her knees pulled tight to her chest. The fire in the hearth slowly burned down to glowing amber embers, casting long, shifting shadows across the opulent room. Ghost never left her side. The massive warhound had curled into a heavy, breathing barricade at the foot of the bed, his ears twitching at every distant sound in the keep. His presence was the only thing keeping Luna's racing heart from shattering her ribs. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the heavy velvet curtains, a sharp knock shattered the silence. Luna flinched. Before she could move, the double doors clicked open. A procession of 4 senior maids entered, carrying a heavy brass bathtub, buckets of steaming water, and an assortment of garments draped over their arms. Leading them was Mrs. Gable, the keep's head housekeeper, a woman whose heavy, calloused hands had boxed Luna's ears more times than she could count. Mrs. Gable stopped dead in her tracks, when she saw Luna sitting on the king's bed. The older woman's face drained of color, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute shock and deep-seated terror. No one spoke. The silence in the room was heavier than the iron buckets the maids were carrying. "Put it down," Luna said. Her voice was raspy, entirely devoid of the meek, trembling tone she had used for years. It shocked even her. The maids scrambled to set the tub down, pouring the steaming water with shaking hands. They didn't dare look at her. They kept their eyes fixed on the floor, terrified of the massive hound that had risen to a sitting position, watching their every move with predatory focus. "The king requests you join him in the corridor in 1 hour," Mrs. Gable choked out, staring at a spot on the wall slightly above Luna's head. She gestured to a dress a younger maid was holding. It was a suffocatingly bright, peach-colored silk gown, dripping with excessive lace and heavy pearls. It was the kind of dress a noblewoman wore to look harmless, delicate, and entirely decorative. It was a cage made of thread. Luna looked at the dress, then at Mrs. Gable. "I am not wearing that." Mrs. Gable blinked, her strict composure fracturing. "It was selected by Elder Thorne's wife. It is the customary attire for a prospective." "I said no," Luna interrupted, her voice dropping a fraction of an inch, taking on a cold, flat edge she didn't know she possessed. Ghost let out a soft, low rumble in the back of his throat. The maids collectively took a step back. Luna slid off the bed. Her bare feet hit the thick crimson carpet. She walked past the trembling women and opened the king's massive oak wardrobe. It was filled with Cassian's dark, severe clothing. Tucked in the very back, almost forgotten, was a woman's riding habit. It was charcoal gray, made of thick, durable wool, with leather reinforcements at the elbows and a high, stiff collar. It had likely belonged to Cassian's mother, the late queen, a woman known more for her prowess in the saddle than her patience for court politics. Luna pulled it out. "I will wear this. Leave the room." 30 minutes later, the heavy doors of the bedchamber opened. Cassian was waiting in the corridor, leaning against the stone wall. He wore his formal alpha regalia, a dark, perfectly tailored coat with silver pauldrons that broadened his already imposing shoulders. He looked like a man preparing to walk onto a battlefield, not a council meeting. He turned his head as the door clicked shut. His dark eyes swept over her, taking in the severe lines of the charcoal riding habit. The dark fabric made her pale skin look almost luminous, and the high collar perfectly concealed the white scar on her neck. She had braided her dark hair tightly against her scalp, offering no loose strands to be grabbed. She looked stripped down, sharp and intensely pragmatic. A faint, dangerous glint of approval flashed in Cassian's eyes. "Thorne's wife sent a peach gown. Why aren't you wearing it?" "Because peach is the color of bruised fruit," Luna replied evenly, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "And I have no intention of looking bruised for your counsel." Cassian's jaw twitched. For a fraction of a second, the Alpha King looked like he wanted to smile. "Ghost," he commanded softly. The hound materialized from the shadows, falling perfectly into step on Luna's left side. "Stay close to me," Cassian said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register that sent a shiver down her spine. "They will try to trap you with words. Let them speak. The more they talk, the more of their own throats they expose." He didn't offer her his arm. A king did not escort a servant. But as they walked down the long, echoing corridors toward the council chamber, Cassian deliberately matched his long strides to her shorter ones, ensuring she was never more than an inch behind his shoulder. They were going to war. The council chamber was a circular room built of ancient, blood-dark mahogany. 7 large high-backed chairs were arranged in a semicircle, occupied by the 7 elders of the pack. They looked like vultures perched on a cliff edge, their eyes sharp, hungry, and fixed entirely on the door. When Cassian entered, the elders stood. It was a mandatory show of respect, but the air in the room was thick with insubordination. When Luna stepped through the threshold behind him, a collective, sharp intake of breath hissed through the chamber. Elder Thorn's face immediately contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. Cassian walked to the center of the room and took his seat at the head of the heavy wooden table. There was no chair for Luna. It was a deliberate, calculated slight, meant to force her to stand before them like a prisoner awaiting sentencing. Before Thorn could speak, Cassian reached out, grabbed the heavy oak chair to his right, and dragged it across the floor with a loud, violent screech of wood against stone. He positioned it directly beside his own. "Sit," Cassian commanded. Luna sat. She kept her spine rigidly straight, resting her hands in her lap to hide the slight tremor in her fingers. Ghost immediately curled around her boots, his massive weight a grounding anchor in the hostile room. "Alpha King," Elder Thorn began, his voice dripping with false diplomacy. "We convened this morning hoping that the theatrics of last night had passed. The pack is in a fragile state. The Summit Pack is demanding an answer regarding Lady Vivian. We cannot afford to insult them over a momentary lapse in judgment." "There was no lapse," Cassian replied, his voice a low, smooth rumble. He leaned back in his chair, looking terrifyingly relaxed. "I was told to choose any woman. I chose." "You chose a floor scrubber." Elder Elias, a thin man with a hooked nose, snapped, slamming his fist onto the table. "A girl with no scent of a pack, no lineage. She has no family, no history, no bloodline to speak of. She is a void, Cassian. A Luna must be the heart of the pack. She must bleed for her people. What does this girl know of our traditions?" "She knows how to survive," Cassian countered coldly, "which is more than I can say for the pampered airs you parade in front of me. Survival is the trait of a rat, not a wolf." Thorn sneered, stepping forward. He signaled to a servant standing in the shadows of the room. "But if the Alpha insists that this creature is worthy of the title, then she must undergo the traditional rite of purity, as is pack law." Cassian's posture instantly shifted. The relaxed demeanor vanished, replaced by a coiled, lethal tension. "The rite of purity is a relic. It hasn't been used in a century." "It is law," Thorn shot back, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "If she is to be Luna, she must prove her fortitude." The servant approached the table, carrying a silver tray. On it sat an ornate, jewel-encrusted chalice. Luna knew immediately what it was: the rite of purity. She had heard whispers of it in the kitchens. The prospective Luna was required to drink a ceremonial wine laced with a tiny, heavily diluted amount of wolfsbane. A true, strong wolf would process the toxin within minutes, proving their supernatural healing. A weak wolf, or a human, would become violently ill. Thorn picked up the chalice and set it firmly on the table in front of Luna. "Drink, girl. Prove you belong in this room." Cassian's hand shot out, his fingers hovering just an inch from the chalice. "Thorn, if you have poisoned my—" "I will take it," Luna interrupted. Cassian's head snapped toward her, his dark eyes wide with warning. "No," his gaze screamed. But Luna was already reaching for the chalice. Her hands were perfectly steady. She wrapped her fingers around the cool metal and lifted it toward her face. She didn't look at the king. She looked dead into Elder Thorn's eyes. She brought the rim of the chalice just below her nose. She inhaled, a slow, deliberate breath. The scent hit the back of her throat like crushed glass. It wasn't the dull, earthy smell of common wolfsbane. It was sharp, sweet, and aggressively metallic. Luna slowly lowered the chalice. The silence in the room was absolute. "Alpine strain," Luna said, her voice echoing clearly off the mahogany walls. "Harvested late in the season, likely after the first frost, which doubles its toxicity. Mixed with a base of fermented elderberry to mask the bitterness." Thorn's smug expression faltered, a flicker of genuine shock cracking his composure. Luna gently set the chalice back onto the silver tray. She didn't take her eyes off Thorn. "A ceremonial dose requires 3 crushed petals per gallon of wine. This chalice contains the distilled oil of the root. It is not a test of fortitude, Elder Thorn. It is a kill dose. 3 sips would stop a grown alpha's heart in 4 minutes." The silence that followed her words was so profound, it felt like a vacuum. Cassian stared at her, his chest rising and falling with slow, heavy breaths. Then, with terrifying calmness, the Alpha King stood up. He picked up the silver chalice. He walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of Elder Thorn. The older man shrank back into his chair, the blood completely draining from his face. "Is she wrong, Thorn?" Cassian whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal, suppressed roar. Thorn opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Cassian turned his hand, pouring the poisoned wine directly onto the polished mahogany table in front of the elder. The liquid hissed violently as the potent, acidic toxin immediately began to eat through the expensive varnish, sending up a thin trail of acrid smoke. Cassian dropped the empty chalice onto the ruined wood with a deafening clatter. He looked at the pale, trembling elders. "If anyone else in this room wishes to test my Luna," Cassian said, his eyes black with rage, "you will do it with steel, and you will do it against me." He turned on his heel, grabbed Luna's arm, and marched her out of the chamber. Cassian did not let go of her arm until they were safely behind the locked doors of his private study. The moment the heavy deadbolt clicked into place, the adrenaline holding Luna upright evaporated. Her knees buckled. She didn't fall. Cassian caught her, his large hands gripping her shoulders, lowering her gently into a heavy leather armchair near the unlit fireplace. Ghost immediately pressed his large head into her lap, whining softly. Luna buried her trembling hands in his thick gray fur, her breathing ragged and shallow. She had just accused the most powerful elder in the territory of attempted murder. The reality of her actions was crashing down on her like a collapsing roof. Cassian walked to the far wall, his movements sharp and agitated. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass, walked back, and pressed it firmly into her shaking hands. "Drink," he ordered. It wasn't a request. Luna brought the glass to her lips. The amber liquid burned a hot, cleansing trail down her throat, settling the violent shivering in her chest. Cassian pulled up a chair and sat directly across from her. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The rage from the council room was gone, replaced by an intense, burning curiosity that felt far more dangerous. "How?" Cassian began, his voice low and deliberate. "Does a kitchen maid know the exact distillation process of alpine wolfsbane?" Luna stared at the amber liquid at the bottom of her glass. She knew this moment was coming. The moment she spoke in that room, she had shattered the illusion of the invisible, ignorant servant. "I asked you a question, Luna." Cassian pressed softly. He reached out, his long fingers gently but firmly tilting her chin up so she was forced to look at him. His touch was warm, calloused, and surprisingly gentle. "You didn't just smell poison. You identified its harvest season. You identified the root oil. That is knowledge kept strictly by pack apothecaries and assassins. If I tell you, Luna whispered, her voice cracking, you will look at me the same way Thorn does, like I am a threat. Thorn tried to kill you because you disrupted his political game, Cassian replied, his thumb lightly brushing the edge of her jaw. I am trying to keep you alive. I cannot do that if I am fighting in the dark. Tell me who you are. Luna closed her eyes. The phantom smell of smoke and burning pine filled her memory, a nightmare she had spent 7 years trying to outrun. You told the council I had no pack scent, Luna said quietly, opening her eyes to meet his piercing gaze. You're right. I use a lye soap mixed with dried sage to strip my scent every morning. I've done it since I was 16. Cassian frowned, his dark eyebrows drawing together. Why? Because if Elder Thorn ever caught my true scent, she breathed, the confession tearing out of her chest, he would know he failed to finish the job 7 years ago. Cassian went completely still. The air in the study seemed to drop 10 degrees. My name is Luna, she continued, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a decade of buried grief. But my father was Silas, the alpha of the Silver Pine pack. Cassian's eyes widened, a rare show of genuine shock. Silver Pine. It was a small, peaceful pack located deep in the northern valleys. 7 years ago, they had been wiped out by a rogue faction. No survivors. It was the tragedy that had ignited the border wars Cassian had spent the last 5 years fighting. Silver Pine was destroyed by rogues, Cassian said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. There were no rogues, Luna said, a single tear breaking free and cutting a hot path down her pale cheek. She didn't bother wiping it away. They were obsidian warriors, wearing unmarked armor. They slaughtered my father. They burned our apothecaries, where I had trained under my mother. I escaped through the root cellar. She looked at Cassian, her gray eyes hard as steel. I didn't run away from the monsters, Cassian. I hid inside their house. Because the man who ordered the strike on my pack is sitting in your council chamber. Before Cassian could process the massive, earth-shattering weight of her confession, a frantic, heavy pounding echoed against the study door. Sire! A muffled voice yelled from the corridor. Sire, open the door. It's urgent. Cassian swore under his breath. He stood up, giving Luna one last, intense look, a look that promised this conversation was far from over, before he crossed the room and threw the deadbolt. General Kyle, Cassian's second in command, stood in the doorway. The hardened warrior looked unusually pale. What is it? Cassian demanded. It's the summit pack, sire, Kale said, breathing heavily. Lady Vivian's father received word of the ceremony. He considers your rejection an act of war. He has blockaded the iron mines and mobilized his northern borders. Kale swallowed hard, glancing nervously past Cassian to where Luna sat by the fireplace. He says he will not stand down. Kale finished grimly. Unless you hand over the servant girl to face summit justice for insulting their bloodline. Cassian stared at General Kale through the narrow crack of the study door. The air in the corridor felt heavy, thick with the impending threat of a two-front war. The Summit Pack was the largest military force in the Northern Territories. Their iron mines supplied half the region's weapons. A blockade was a death sentence for their economy. A mobilization was a promise of slaughter. Tell the Summit envoy to hold his position at the border, Cassian said, his voice deadly calm, devoid of the panic Kale clearly expected. Tell him that if Lady Vivian's father wishes to declare war over a bruised ego, he will find my armies ready to meet him at the Valley Pass. Kale's eyes widened. "Sire, with respect, over a servant? We are already fractured. The Council will not support a war against Summit. They will demand we hand the girl over. The Council does not command my armies, Kale. I do." Cassian's jaw set into a rigid, unforgiving line. "Mobilize the vanguard. Double the watch on the northern perimeter. And Kale?" "Yes, sire." "Do not let Elder Thorn leave the keep. Post your most trusted men at the gates. No one goes in or out without my explicit seal." Kale hesitated, glancing nervously at the doorframe. But the terrifying absolute authority radiating from his king silenced any further objections. He pounded his fist over his heart in a sharp salute and vanished down the corridor. Cassian closed the heavy oak door, sliding the deadbolt back into place with a definitive clack. He turned back to the room. Luna was still sitting in the leather armchair, her knuckles white as she gripped the glass of whiskey. She looked terrifyingly small against the massive furniture, but her gray eyes were clear, focused, and unblinking. She had heard every word. "You are going to fight them," Luna whispered, the reality of it washing over her. "You are going to drag your people into a war just to keep me here." "I am not going to war over a servant," Cassian replied, walking slowly back toward the fireplace. He stopped in front of her, his towering frame casting a long shadow across her face. "I am going to war because the Summit Pack thinks they can dictate who sits beside me on the throne. And because the man pulling their strings is sitting in my council chamber." Cassian knelt, bringing himself down to her eye level. It was a shocking gesture of equality from an alpha king. Ghost immediately rested his chin heavily on Cassian's knee, letting out a soft, approving huff. "You said Thorn ordered the strike on Silverpine," Cassian said, his voice dropping to a low, intense hum. "You said you hid in the root cellar. You watched them burn your home. If Thorn used obsidian warriors in unmarked armor, he had to pay them. He had to organize them. A man like Thorn doesn't leave a blood trail unless he thinks it's completely covered." Luna swallowed hard, the ghost of burning pine and copper filling her senses. He covered it well, but he didn't cover everything. Cassian's eyes sharpened. "What do you have?" "When I crawled out of the ashes 2 days later," Luna began, her voice trembling slightly before smoothing into cold iron, "I found the body of the mercenary commander. My father had fought him. My father died, but he managed to sever the man's arm before he fell." Cassian remained perfectly still, letting her speak, letting the buried trauma breathe the air for the first time in 7 years. "The commander carried a leather satchel," Luna continued. "Inside was a ledger of payments, written in cipher, and a heavy gold signet ring used to seal the orders. It bore the crest of the Thorn estate." Cassian's breath hitched. A signet ring. That was indisputable proof of treason. "Where is it?" "When I fled south and integrated into your keep's servant quarters, I knew I couldn't keep it on me. I was subjected to random searches by Mrs. Gable every month," Luna explained. She looked toward the heavy stone floor beneath their feet. "I buried it, deep in the old catacombs beneath the keep's eastern wing, in the crypts of the first alphas." Cassian stood up slowly, a dark, dangerous energy radiating from his shoulders. "Thorn is pushing the Summit Pack into a frenzy to force my hand. He wants me distracted by a border war so he can orchestrate a coup from within. If we have that ring, we can cut the head off the snake," Luna finished, standing up to join him. She didn't look like a trembling maid anymore. She looked like the daughter of an alpha. But the eastern wing is guarded by Thorn's personal sentries. He claimed it as his family's private meditation grounds 3 years ago. Cassian smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator that had just found the scent of blood. "They are about to find out," Cassian whispered, "that I do not ask permission to walk in my own house." The descent into the catacombs was suffocatingly dark. The air tasted of ancient dust, damp stone, and forgotten secrets. Cassian led the way, carrying a single, dimly burning iron lantern that cast long, monstrous shadows against the curved stone walls. Luna walked directly behind him, her footsteps light and practiced from years of moving unseen through the keep. Ghost brought up the rear, his massive paws completely silent on the uneven cobblestones, his amber eyes scanning the darkness with lethal precision. They had bypassed Thorn's surface guards easily enough. Cassian knew the hidden servant corridors better than the elders ever would. But down here, in the labyrinthine crypts, the silence was oppressive. "How far?" Cassian murmured, his voice barely a breath. "Third corridor on the left," Luna whispered back, pointing toward an arched doorway draped in thick, silvery cobwebs. "The tomb of Alpha Valerius. There is a loose stone behind his sarcophagus." They moved swiftly. The temperature dropped significantly as they entered the ancient burial chamber. The heavy stone sarcophagus dominated the center of the room, covered in thick layers of dust. Luna immediately dropped to her knees behind the monument, running her fingers along the base of the damp stone wall. She counted the bricks from the corner, 3 over, 2 down. She pressed her palms against a seemingly solid block of granite and pushed. With a harsh, grinding scrape, the stone slid backward. From the dark cavity, she pulled a small, heavy iron lockbox. Cassian held the lantern closer as Luna flipped the rusted latch. The hinges shrieked in protest. Inside, wrapped in a piece of scorched, blood-stained cloth, was a thick leather ledger. Resting on the top of it was a heavy gold ring, the unmistakable crest of a coiled serpent stamped into its face, the ancient sigil of the Thorn bloodline. "He's a dead man," Cassian breathed, staring at the gold ring. He reached out, his large fingers carefully picking up the undeniable proof of high treason. Before Cassian could secure the ring in his coat, a sharp metallic shing echoed through the crypt. It was the sound of a sword being drawn from a scabbard. Ghost erupted into a deafening, terrifying roar, lunging forward into the darkness. "Hold him!" a harsh voice shouted from the corridor. 3 men stepped into the dim light of the lantern. They wore the dark, unmarked leather armor of rogue mercenaries. But Cassian recognized the leader instantly. It was Marcus, the captain of Elder Thorn's personal guard. "Well, well," Marcus sneered, his sword gleaming in the low light. Elder Thorn suspected the little rat might try to dig up her buried treasures. "He told us to keep an eye on the crypts." Cassian slowly set the lantern on the sarcophagus. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply stepped in front of Luna, his body a massive, impenetrable wall between her and the mercenaries. "Marcus," Cassian said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "you are standing in the crypts of my ancestors, drawing steel on your king. Do you understand what happens next?" "I understand that you've gone mad, sire." Marcus spat, signaling for his 2 men to fan out. Choosing a servant over the packs, risking war with Summit. Elder Thorn is simply doing what is necessary for the survival of the Obsidian Pack. "We will tell the council you were ambushed by rogues in the dark." Marcus lunged. He never made it halfway across the room. Ghost hit the captain like a freight train of muscle and teeth. The massive hound tackled Marcus to the ground, his powerful jaws snapping shut around the man's sword arm with the sickening crunch of breaking bone. Marcus screamed, his weapon clattering uselessly across the stone floor. The other 2 guards froze, horrified by the sheer brutality of the hound. That second of hesitation was all Cassian needed. The Alpha King moved with a blur of coiled, predatory speed. He closed the distance to the second guard, dodging a wild, panicked swing of a broadsword. Cassian's fist connected with the guard's throat with a devastating crack, sending the man collapsing to the floor, gasping for air. The third guard dropped his weapon instantly, throwing his hands in the air and falling to his knees, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Cassian stood breathing heavily, adjusting the cuffs of his coat as if he had merely swatted a fly. He looked down at the whimpering captain pinned beneath Ghost's massive paws. "You chose the wrong Alpha, Marcus," Cassian said coldly. He turned to the trembling third guard. "Get up. You are going to carry your captain to the Great Hall. And you are going to tell the council exactly who sent you down here." Cassian turned back to Luna. She was clutching the iron lockbox to her chest, her eyes wide but surprisingly calm. She had seen worse violence the night her pack fell. She was not a fragile noblewoman. She was a survivor. "Wash your face," Cassian told her, his dark eyes burning with a fierce protective fire. "Wash the lie out of your hair. Let them smell exactly who you are. We end this tonight." The Great Hall was in a state of chaotic uproar. Elder Thorn stood at the head of the heavy mahogany table, surrounded by the remaining elders and the heavily armed envoy from the Summit Pack. The envoy, a massive, scarred warrior named Corin, looked furious, demanding answers that Thorn was expertly spinning into a web of deceit. "I assure you, Commander Corin," Thorn was saying smoothly, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "The king is unwell. The trauma of the border wars has broken his mind. He has locked himself away with a lowly servant girl while your borders are insulted. The council is prepared to step in and assume provisional control. We will hand the girl over to your justice, and the treaty with Lady Vivienne will proceed." "You will hand over nothing," a voice boomed like a crack of thunder. The heavy double doors of the great hall violently slammed open, shattering the wood against the stone walls. Cassian strode into the room. He was covered in crypt dust, his knuckles bruised, but he radiated an aura of pure, suffocating dominance. The ambient chatter in the room instantly died. Every wolf in the hall instinctively lowered their eyes, the sheer gravity of his alpha presence forcing their submission. Following closely behind him were Kale's elite guards, dragging the battered, bleeding forms of Marcus and his mercenaries. They threw the traitors roughly onto the polished marble floor at Thorn's feet. Thorn's face turned the color of ash. He stumbled backward, his back hitting the mahogany table. "What is the meaning of this, Cassian?" Elder Elias stuttered, gripping the edges of his chair. Cassian didn't answer. He reached into his coat and slammed the heavy gold signet ring down onto the table. The sharp clack echoed through the dead silent hall. "Treason," Cassian announced, his voice vibrating with lethal intent. He looked directly at the summit envoy. "Elder Thorn has been manipulating your pack, Corin. He ordered the slaughter of the Silver Pine Pack 7 years ago to destabilize the region, and he has been using your outrage tonight as a smokescreen to stage a coup." Corin frowned deeply, looking from the king to the trembling elder. "These are heavy accusations, Cassian. Where is your proof?" "My proof," Cassian said, stepping aside, "is the survivor he failed to kill." The dawn broke crisp and clear over the obsidian keep. On the high stone balcony overlooking the newly unified northern valleys, Cassian and Luna stood side by side, watching the sun chase the shadows from the mountains. Ghost slept peacefully at their feet, the warhound finally at rest. The political machinations were over, the traitors were gone. Luna leaned her head against Cassian's broad shoulder, breathing in the scent of pine and cold air. They had found each other in the ashes. Two hardened survivors forging an empire not through coercion, but through profound, unbreakable trust. The king had chosen his Luna, and the pack would never be the same. If you enjoyed this dramatic tale of betrayal, survival, and unexpected romance, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more original stories. Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below.